Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I know it's been a minute, but let's get right into our topic of today, which is evaluating the effectiveness of media regulation in both a big and small or independent creator in the documentary field. In order to do this, we are going to go through a series of questions to evaluate each company and how they're both regulated differently in their own way and how effective that regulation is as well. So before we get right into it, I'm going to give us a little bit of background on both of our companies, with our big company being AMC Studios and our small company being an independent filmmaker, which is Joshua Zeman. AMC is part of a conglomerate being owned by AMC Network Inc., which operates a multitude of channels, with obviously its main goal being to produce high-quality content in order to reach a vast variety of audiences, which is typically the main goal for these big industries, just to make the best possible content in order to be able to reach this massive, huge audience globally. On the other hand, we have our small company or our independent filmmaker, Joshua Zeman, which has full creative control in his filming and what he wants to do with his projects. And not only that, but it's a little different to what his goal is, with big companies being to just reach a huge global audience. On the other hand, independent filmmakers such as Joshua Zeman, typically their main goal is to create a story and a style which is their own, and they really tend to break those boundaries of creativity that bigger industries aren't able to break, because their main goal isn't to reach these huge audiences and make sure that they're in the restrictions of what these huge audiences all want from them. Rather, their goal is to satisfy their own creative wants and put it out into the world and hope that some people will enjoy their work. Obviously, in the case for Joshua Zeman, his idea is really to create this blend of factual storytelling with a cinematic dramatization, which is similar to what I want to do in my project. So in a lot of ways, I do take a lot of inspiration from Joshua Zeman, but we'll talk about that more towards the end once we've really discussed all these different questions that we have in store for our podcast today. So let's get straight into our first question now that I've given us a little bit of background information on both our companies. Okay, so our first question is, how does the company's product use or challenge conventions? So if we're talking about our big company first, which is AMC Studios, they tend to have a very basic and predictable structure in their storytelling, not really going too far off of what a normal documentary entails, using things like interviews, archival footage, and certain reenactments, but they tend to really keep it in a very basic and predictable type of structure for their documentaries. And it's not that it's a bad thing, but they do this in order to really attract what audiences are used to in a documentary. They don't want to really wander off or venture off too far from what is the ideal documentary style, because they want to attract those people who are already, used to those boundaries of what a documentary is supposed to be. So they really tend to have a consistent narrative that aligns with different documentaries in order to maximize their ratings and profitability in these different documentaries that they're making, which has a huge contrast to what Joshua Zeman does. Unlike these big corporations, he has the ability to really play around with what he wants to do and be creative and innovate the style of what we normally see as a documentary. He really plays around with those borders and those lines of what is considered a ordinary, like, structured type of documentary, and instead he experiments and he goes like a little on the riskier side, blending like investigative journalism with cinematic techniques, where he often includes tension building, atmosphere, and overall just a less conventional narrative structure. So in a way, unlike those big corporations and companies, which instead of challenging conventions, they kind of stick to those conventions that are already set in place for them, small independent creators challenge those conventions and really kind of wander off the original structure and play around and become a little experimental in that area, because they both have different goals, which can be so clearly seen just in this one question, where you can see that the big companies strive for, kind of being able to please everyone's ideal, thoughts of what a documentary is, unlike these small creators who, instead of appealing to the audience, they want to appeal to their own creative ideals and put it out into the world in hopes that the audience will also enjoy what they're doing and their essentially new way of telling a documentary, or a more creative or experimental way to do this documentary. Now, moving on to our second question, which is how does a company's product engage with its audience, and how would it be distributed as a media text? So, in other words, what we really want to know is how regulation affects what can be shown and to who it can be shown, and where these different projects or media texts are being distributed by each company, and how that also affects the regulations and the rules set in place for those different companies. If we look at our big company, which is AMC Studios, they air on national television and streaming platforms, which means that they must follow broadcast regulations. So there's certain things that they have to be in these certain restrictions and guidelines in order to be able to be delivered to such a massive group of people, such a big audience. Because the bigger your audience is, the more restricted you are going to be in your content, because you have to make sure that those restrictions really align with this huge group of people that you will be delivering this, media to. So it places so many regulations on the big corporations as to what they can show, and different companies that regulate their media would be like the Federal Communications Commission or Motion Pictures Association, with the FCC overseeing broadcasting standards, licensings, and other things like that, and MPA helping regulate filming ratings and content standards within the filming industry. So obviously, the age range is typically above 14 years old for these bigger corporations, because since they are doing crime documentaries, it is typically targeted towards a more grown-up audience. But obviously, depending on how gory each documentary can get, there really is a shift in their ratings, according to each different type of project that they do. So really, what the most important thing to look at here is the fact that because they have to deliver to such a big audience, they're so restricted on what they can show or what they can, give the audience, because they have to make sure that it's within the guidelines that they need to follow, which these guidelines are made in order to be able to accommodate such a huge number of people and what they deem is okay to show or not, which is so hard to manage with such a big amount of people, making the restrictions so much tighter on these big corporations, which is so different to what we see in small companies or independent creators like Joshua Zeman, because since they're not aired on national television or these big streaming platforms, typically instead they're shown in certain streaming services or festivals and just smaller based platforms they have a much more creative freedom to do different things with their documentaries. They can go a little more gory. They can show different things that aren't so strictly like regulated, because of the fact that they're not hitting such a big amount of people all at once, unlike these big corporations that are hitting national TV, which means that they have to avoid certain, like graphic content or language that violates like their network standards, which is something that smaller creators don't have to worry as much, since they have much more creative liberty than these bigger companies. And people who do watch their stuff have to honestly, in a way, more like auto-regulate what they want to watch, because they are putting out their own thing. And if you don't want to watch or you don't agree with what they're showing, then that is up to you to not watch that film, as opposed to these bigger companies where it's really in your face, because it's like on national television on these big streaming platforms, and it's like, we need to regulate for the people who are going to be watching, since it's such a big group of people, like a big audience, a really global audience. Now our next question is, how does companies' production skills develop throughout this project? And for this, I kind of want to touch on the challenges of regulation over time, as social media and media on its own has been able to expand globally and reach so many more people than it was able to before, which honestly, it has its pros and cons, but in a lot of ways it has many more downsides, because of the fact that regulation is so much more difficult now because of how global something can be. And because something is so global, we are not the same in every country. Like, there are different things that are acceptable in certain countries that you wouldn't find acceptable in other countries, which makes it so much harder to regulate something that goes global. Like, for example, things like, big corporations like AMC Studios, where their things go worldwide, not just like, only like in state or in the town. It's something that goes worldwide. It can be so hard to create a documentary that is regulated by the standards of every single country that's going to be able to watch this documentary. So one of the main issues is, how do you both balance protecting audiences from harmful or inappropriate content while still giving them the freedom to choose what they want to watch, and also giving the producers the creative freedom to express themselves in a different way than other documentaries have done so in the past. And that's where, it can get really difficult. And that's why for bigger companies, regulation tends to be stricter, since obviously, like I said, it's such a global audience. But at the same time, we have to understand that media regulation we can't advance media and what we can do and the creativity that can be found in media if we consistently regulate it so strictly. So there has to be some balance where we can also allow not only people to create other stuff, but allow people to watch what they want to watch, because there's some people that have different opinions on how far media should be regulated, which is why, in a way, although media regulation has advanced in the sense that it has been able to regulate media to a certain level so that, audiences aren't met with things that shouldn't be like, that would be harmful to them, or that would be like, inappropriate content in a way. Although it has regulated that, we also need to leave space for people to self-regulate in order for people to also be able to watch what they want to watch and not have media that would essentially be the exact same thing, because it's so regulated. So I think that is where we really see that development of regulation, where although regulation has developed to a point where we do protect the audience from certain stuff, it also, because it's grown, because the how far media can reach people has grown, it's also had to develop in a way where regulation also has to be self-monitored. So in a way, people need to self-regulate the media that they watch, and this allows space for people to choose, like, if they like this certain thing that other people might not be comfortable with, which allows for people to have a variation of things, which wouldn't be possible if media was so strictly regulated to the point where everything would be so similar that there's no really choosing and experimenting with that sense of media. So I think that is one of the biggest developments over media regulations throughout the year, which is where we both have to regulate the media so that, it is globally accepted, but at the same time leave some wiggle room for people to self-regulate as well in order for people to have a variety of choice. So I think that's pretty much the rundown of regulation and how it affects companies differently. And overall, basically what we really covered was how bigger companies have a stricter regulation on different things because they tend to reach out to such a large audience, while smaller companies or individual creators have a much less regulated media because they don't necessarily go out to such huge streaming platforms that are aired nationally or globally, which allows them to have more creative freedom in what they want to do and explore and do different things that aren't typical in their field, which in this case is the documentary field. So with that all being said, I want to reflect back a little bit to my main project, which, if you guys have already heard, it's basically going to be a documentary that's going to be a crime documentary because we're still sticking to that horror drama that we had last year. So in a way, I feel like my project really does connect and reflect a lot of Joshua's work because it has so many similar elements in the sense that I do also want to have that investigative journalism style mixed with cinematic techniques as well, which basically what that means is that I want to have a murder documentary which not only entails the basic structure of a documentary, which is the interviews and the footage and all this stuff, but I also want to have a lot of reenactment and a lot of drama and a lot of investigative journalism mixed with cinematic techniques which would be used to do those reenactments. So it's not exactly, although it is factual storytelling, it also has cinematic dramatization with reenactments and just different stuff that doesn't conventionally make it a normal murder mystery documentary where it's very facts based and it only shows factual clips of the victim or stuff like that. But I also wanted to just have the sense of drama where we see reenactments of what happened or what could have possibly happened to the victim. And so it's just kind of a little different than your original documentary, which is why I would really see my project leaning more towards an independent filmmaker or creator, because I don't want to really stick to those, conventional styles of documentary and regulations that are placed on those documentaries. Instead, I kind of want to break away from the traditional documentary, crime documentary, and kind of give it my own twist, similar to how Joshua is doing it. In fact, very similar to what Joshua is doing. So in that sense, I would consider my project more as a independent filmmaker, and I would produce and market my product accordingly to what a small filmmaker would be like. So in the sense that my product, I would want it to be aired on things like YouTube and festivals where the audience isn't so big, allowing me to have less restrictions on my project and just allowing me to be more creative with where I take my project. So I think in that sense, that's how I would regulate my own media, very similar to how Joshua's media is regulated, which is very little, obviously. So I think that is basically the main takeaway for my own project. And trust me, this is not the last you will be hearing. We are still currently in the research phases of my project, but soon we will have it up and running. And I know you guys will all be anxiously waiting till that day. So this is all for now. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you guys in the next one.